So thanks everyone for coming. So my name's Sam Wimpenny and I'm going to talk about a sort of 2-year-long project that we've had running now through COMET's EDI committee, really, that's involved a whole load of different people in COMET to try and compile a set of research fieldwork guidelines for postgraduates, for postdocs, and for research for faculty who are doing research fieldwork, to try and make it more safe, more equitable, and more inclusive for everyone involved. And I think one of the reasons why we were kind of interested in doing this, and we think it's really important, is that a lot of the research that we do in COMET is relatively unique in a sense that we're often in very remote places, like shown in this picture in the background. We're often working with international collaborators, again, like shown in this figure here. We're often in relatively small groups of people. So, maybe there's 2 or 3 of us in the field, which means that we can have quite complex power structures involved there. Often if you're with more senior members of faculty, for example, and you're a postgraduate researcher, and the fieldwork that we do often can lead to quite isolating scenarios. So we think there's a lot of unique things related to the types of research that we do that we need to try and address to make our fieldwork and our field practice definitely more inclusive, safer for everyone, and certainly we want to try and make the outcomes far more equitable for not only for people who are doing the fieldwork, but also for the communities that we're working in and working with. So a thing that I want to stress is that this has kind of been put together by a lot of different people. What we're trying to do is draw on some of our experiences doing field research, but mostly the experiences of others, writings from other people. Lots and lots of people have been writing some really fantastic papers and blog posts about their undergraduate changes to their undergraduate research policies. And what we want to try and do is take that really useful information and try and apply it to the research fieldwork setting, because that's often a little bit of a law unto itself. So hopefully I'll get through all of this in about half an hour. So I'm going to try and convince everybody why we need some research fieldwork guidelines, I think, and particularly focusing on research fieldwork here, not necessarily undergraduate fieldwork, which might be in a bit more of a formal setting, if you like. I mean, what we're going to do is really take a lot of the advice and changes that have come from undergraduate fieldwork policy. I'm going to try and explain what we mean by safe, inclusive, and equitable. This is the thing that we're kind of aiming for. So I want to try and explain what that means, so we all know what we're after. I'm going to talk about some guiding principles that really come from our reading about safe and inclusive fieldwork practice, mostly from other people's writings. I'm going to talk about how we actually decided to construct the guidelines in the end, what's its format, and I'm going to hopefully show how you could use it, and I'm particularly going to use it by outlining some kind of relatively difficult topics that we might come across when we're either organizing or participating in field research. So some of these might be slightly uncomfortable topics for some people. I'm going to talk about monitoring and the impact of the guidelines and trying to use this monitoring to update our view of kind of best practice and advice. And I think that's really important, is that we want these to be a living document. We want them to constantly update, and we want to try and stimulate discussion around our research fieldwork practice in COMET and across other fields. And then hopefully at the end there should be plenty of time for some discussion. I'm aware that lots of people are working on this kind of topic, so it'd be great also to get some feedback. Certainly not saying that we have all the answers here. What we're trying to do is just initiate these discussions and try and put forward some advice. So starting off with, why do we actually need research fieldwork guidelines? Well, firstly, research fieldwork can form quite a significant barrier to scientists from minority backgrounds, both at sort of engaging and being successful in the earth sciences. Now, we know earth sciences has very poor representation across ethnic minorities, particularly in postgraduate research and higher. So what we want to try and do is to try and change our research practice, and also build in strategies into our research practice to make it safer and more inclusive for everyone. And ultimately, this is only going to lead to more positive experiences on fieldwork for colleagues, for friends, and for other scientists. We know that research fieldwork is not a safe space. So this is unfortunately proven by a series of different studies. So this is a really good one, the Survey of Academic Field Experiences that took place in 2014. And this study found that 72% of women respondents and 41% of men had experienced sexual harassment on fieldwork. And that is quite an eye-opening statistic, but it's kind of the issue that I think we're facing with research fieldwork practice as it is that it's just simply not a safe space, not only for women, but for all sorts of different identities and people from different backgrounds. So we want to try and change that. And I think an important way to do that is through starting to have discussions about the way that we do fieldwork and try and change that practice. There's often very little accountability for problematic research practice when we're in the field. And this all comes from typically these quite small groups that we're in. Often we're with people who are maybe more senior than we are, if we're early career scientists. And these people can be gatekeepers to our future career trajectories. So that can lead to little accountability when we experience or somebody experiences something that they consider problematic. So what we want to try and do is address this by building in strategies that hold people accountable for their behavior and their practice, and also to try and provide guidance and evidence of positive research culture. And the outcomes of research fieldwork are often not equitable, and they often perpetuate existing power structures too. So a really good example of this is what's now often called helicopter research. And this is when people, researchers from high income or privileged settings carry out research in low income or resource poor settings without very much involvement of the communities or very little benefit to local researchers who you work with. So this is clearly an issue because it sort of perpetuates historical imbalances. It's kind of quite neo-colonial in its approach. It's exploitative. It's bad not only for science, like in this quote, but it's bad for the outcomes and impacts on the communities that we work with. And ultimately, we would hope that the science that we do would benefit in the long term the communities that we're working in and with. So these are just 4 really important reasons why I think we need specifically research fieldwork guidelines. Another really important reason is that there's been a really fantastic range of research really coming out in a series of different papers in all sorts of different journals, in different blogs, really in different outlets that provide advice and critiques of the way that fieldwork's currently practiced, not only in teaching, but also in research. So here's just a sort of a smorgasbord of them, if you like. And they touch on all sorts of things from kind of the principle of simply just trying to reduce the amount of fieldwork that we do, but not only from an environmental perspective, but also, the impacts that it has on the communities that we might visit, and can we justify that, all the way through to steps to try and protect and other colleagues or students who are on our research fieldwork. So what we wanted to do through the COMET guidelines is to provide a space where we can compile all these different great studies and try and get them exposed to people who are designing and doing research fieldwork practice. So we wanted to try and get all this stuff together and put it into a kind of coherent framework so people have access to it in one place. And finally, I think it's a reasonable question to ask, well, why do we need to do this at all if there's already a set of research fieldwork guidelines and codes of conducts out there from lots of different institutions? This is just an example from the University of Worcester here on the left. There's a recently published code of conduct for ethical fieldwork from a group in Oxford, which is really, really good. And again, there's a document down here, which is inclusive fieldwork, inclusive field practice action plan. I think this is from UNAVCO. So these are very similar documents to what we're thinking about trying to produce through COMET. But I think the unique thing that we want to try and do is to provide field-specific advice and codes of practice. So a lot of the things that we do are quite niche. So things like paleoseismic trenching, for example, collecting gas data around volcanoes, going to volcano observatories. So we want to try and provide advice that's relevant and specific to our scientists and our postgraduates. We want to try and raise awareness of best practice in our field, which I think is important. It's important to stress to people that this is a really critical exercise that we should all be engaging and committing time to wherever we can. And we also wanted to engage COMET members in these discussions and be part of the discussions that are producing these other types of fieldwork guidelines from other institutions like UNAVCO and whatnot, and other institutions, other universities. I think one thing that's important to mention as well here that's not on this slide is that COMET has lots of scientists who work between different institutions. And that means that kind of institutional codes of practice aren't necessarily the same. So we might all, if we're scientists from Leeds, for example, going on fieldwork with a scientist from Sheffield, we might not necessarily have the same risk assessments, the same codes of practice. What we want to try and do is to have everybody kind of filling out the same forms, agreeing to the same codes of standards of practice, and trying to reflect on the same important questions if we're going to be doing fieldwork together. And I think the final thing to stress is that this is kind of an exercise that's been led by scientists, and it's for the benefit of science impact and scientists. It's not a box ticking exercise. It's not designed to make more red tape. It's not designed to make more forms to fill in. I mean, I think the way we should view this is that it's critical not only to kind of positive experiences for our colleagues and for ourselves in our actual research, but also it's critical to ensuring that we actually have and maximize the impact of our science and get the most out of our field work. So I think it's just important to stress that this is worth committing time to and committing as much kind of mental capacity to it as we can. Okay, so moving on now to what do we mean by safety, inclusivity, and equity. So this is ultimately what we're trying to attain by or something that we're trying to contribute to by introducing these guidelines. And this is a kind of cartoon that comes up a lot in various different forms in talks like this, that tries to explain the difference between simply equality, a state of equity, and some form of justice. And really this starts off with, we've got three different people who are starting off from a different position. We've got one person who's slightly taller, one person who's slightly shorter, but they all want to see this football match, but there's this barrier in the way. And if we provide equal opportunity to see that barrier, which is see that game, which is kind of shown by these boxes, then it doesn't necessarily balance out the fact that we have pre-existing historical structural inequality in the way that that things might be operating. And that's true certainly for fieldwork. Equity is where we try to put strategies into place that kind of balance out that opportunity. So everybody now has the same opportunity to see the game, but we still have those barriers in place. Whilst justice in this figure, at least, is where those barriers have been removed and everybody has the same opportunity to see that game, irrespective of their initial positionality on this. That's ultimately what we're aiming for. And I think in terms of safety and inclusivity, the way that we should summarize those aims are that we want to try and ensure that fieldworkers' physical and mental well-being is protected whilst on fieldwork. We want to try and remove any barriers that exist to ensure that those who want to participate and succeed from being part of fieldwork can. Okay, so now we know what we're aiming for. I'm just quickly going to go through sort of three guiding principles that led us down the path of how we're actually going to construct these guidelines. And I'm going to go through these with three different quotes from three different really good papers on this subject. So this first one comes from Clancy in 2014, and it sort of highlights the fact that policies emphasizing safety, inclusivity, and collegiality have the potential to improve field experiences of a diversity of researchers, especially during early career stages. So I think what they're trying to highlight here is the fact that it's really for early career scientists, particularly from minority backgrounds, who are those who are facing the most severe and significant barriers to participating, being included in fieldwork and getting equitable outcomes. So we wanted to try and focus our efforts on sort of benefiting early career stage researchers, but also, the practice would be beneficial for people across career stages. And the other thing they highlight was that principal investigators, i.e. people's PhD supervisors, senior scientists in the field, are particularly well positioned to influence workplace culture at their field sites. So we wanted to also try and focus the strategies that we advocate for on things that senior scientists can do to try and break down these barriers. But again, this applies to everybody, not just people who are more senior. So the second one is that topics related to identity are inherently difficult to broach, and that they strongly encourage all relevant individuals and institutions to hold harmless, good faith efforts to use documents like the Fieldwork Guidelines for engaging in dialogue about core issues of safety and inclusion. So here, I think what this quote by Demery is trying to highlight, and what we took from this, is that we're really trying to encourage open communication prior to going on fieldwork. That's really, really key, it seems to be, from our reading and different people's anecdotal evidence, that's critical to ensuring that strategies can be put in place to have positive outcomes for people on research fieldwork is open communication prior to travel. And we should try and hold harmless any efforts to engage in that kind of dialogue. So, the guidelines certainly aren't perfect, and there's going to be things in there that change, but we need to at least try and include people's views and include advice in there to help improve fieldwork practice. But we should be open to changing those. We should be open to changing our understanding of what we consider to be best practice too. So we've tried to include that by having the document be a living document where it's constantly changing. We're constantly listening and receiving feedback from people through events like this, and also through workshops that we've held with scientists and members of COMET. Another guiding principle, and the final one, is that we're trying to follow this idea of nothing about us without us. So this is a rallying cry for access and inclusion centered around the needs of individuals with disabilities. And it's about the process of collaboratively making decisions that will ultimately impact the people who the decisions are about directly. So we really want to include as many people in this process as we can, so that the advice and guidance and examples of best practice that we give directly involve the people which the advice is about. So that's another key principle that we've tried to take into designing these guidelines. So what this eventually led us to is a sort of three-part construction. So what we have is three different documents. We've got a code of conduct. We've got what we're calling an augmented risk assessment, which is something that you would fill out alongside your typical university risk assessment, because not all of them include the sort of social dimension of safety and inclusivity of researchers. Some of them, at least most of them that I've filled out, typically focus on personal safety, accountability, what happens if you have a car crash for example. And then what we have for reference is this set of written guidelines, which people can use when filling out the risk assessment for guidance and advice on how to address some of these self-reflective questions that we have in the augmented risk assessment. So really the way that we break this down is that the code of conduct is the ground rules. This is what everybody's signing up to, a kind of set of, a behaviour that we're all agreeing to. The augmented risk assessment is a kind of self-reflective exercise to try and get us to think about how we're going to mitigate any issues that we might face whilst in the field, and how do we actually instigate and start some of the conversations that might be difficult to broach with other people who are on our fieldwork. And the guidelines are essentially a compilation of information from papers, from blog posts, from people's experiences about what practice they've found to be beneficial for them. And ultimately what we hope is that by doing these prior to travel, and also you can reference them whilst you're in the field, everyone ultimately benefits from this. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll quickly just show you what the code of conduct, the risk assessment, and the guidelines look like. They're designed and aimed to be quite short and quite to the point. So the code of conduct is just a single A4 piece of paper, and on it it's got a series of different commitments, 6 different commitments that the aim is that you read prior to every fieldwork, you reflect on, and you sign at the bottom, everybody who's in your field team. And these commitments include things that I think we would all generally agree are important. So committed to treating everyone associated with our fieldwork with respect and dignity, for example. Committed to protecting and preserving the heritage of the regions we visit, which is, I think, a really important point for earth scientists in particular. and committed to championing the communities and scientists that we're working with and who host us. So these are just 3 of the 6 different examples. But essentially what we hope people will do is read this and everybody signs up to it. And this kind of lays the ground rules. It sets the expectations for behavior and practice whilst on fieldwork. The augmented risk assessment is just another sort of page of A4, and it's laid out in 4 sections, which cover safety and inclusivity in fieldwork, ensuring equitable outcomes, minimizing environmental impacts of our fieldwork, and ethical acknowledgement and sampling. And within each one of those boxes, here's just an example for the safe and inclusive fieldwork. What we've got is 4 self-reflective questions on the left. So an example here is just, how has your team ensured open lines of communication for all fieldwork participants to voice their concerns and needs prior to travel, for example. And on the right, what we have is a set of links that you can click on when you're filling this out that will take you to sections of the written guidelines, which have extracts from papers. They have links to a blog post and things like that that will provide you with advice on how best to, or how to answer that question, or how other people have gone about answering that question. So that's what the risk assessment is designed to do. So it's really meant to be driven by the field team. One thing that I think we haven't quite worked out yet is whether this should be filled out by everyone together as a collaborative exercise with everybody in the field team there, because that will hopefully be a way to kind of instigate some of these discussions, or whether this would be filled out individually. But that's something I think we're interested to hear what people's views are on this, and what people have found might work for them. And then the final thing is that we have the set of written guidelines, which is essentially just a big Google Doc that contains information extracted from papers, from people's experiences, from blog posts, that really dives in and provides you with more information about different topics. So we've got a whole bunch of different stuff on safety and inclusive research fieldwork. We've got set on minimizing environmental impacts of fieldwork, how you gauge environmental impacts. Got material on ensuring equitable research outcomes, acknowledgement and sampling, and particularly some of the sort of slightly niche aspects of the kind of research we might do, like what's the best practice in paleoseismic trenching, what are the things you need to consider. What if you come across archaeological remains, for example? There's some really good information in the archaeology literature about how people address those issues. And then finally, we've got a section on financial barriers in research fieldwork and what you might need to consider to try and mitigate those. So hopefully that gives you an overview of what the written guidelines actually constitute. And what I'm going to try and do now is show you hopefully how they might work in the case of some really quite difficult topics that people might be facing when going on fieldwork or designing fieldwork. So this is just an first example, which is that you're a new graduate student and a person of color with concerns that your supervisor is not taking appropriate actions to ensure your safety when you go on fieldwork together to an area that has a history of racially motivated violence. And just to say that a lot of these examples are come from just our discussions within the working group about what issues people have or might face when going on fieldwork. So the way that we can see the guidelines being used to hopefully address an issue like this is that initially people would have signed the code of conduct together, and this would have laid out the ground rules. And one of the commitments people are making here is to protecting the safety of all team members, and having discussed any potential issues that team members may face and trying to mitigate them well before travel. So this has kind of laid the groundwork. So hopefully this is a way to try and instigate discussion to get senior members of the field team to try and consider and empathize with this, with early career scientists. In this case, we've got the augmented risk assessment, which is asking a question, what steps have you taken to ensure the safety of all participants in the field, particularly focusing on BIPOC and LGBTQ plus scientists. So, explicitly trying to ask that question of people, and trying to raise these conversations and get people to engage with this. And then if people find that their supervisors aren't willing to engage with these conversations, we also have advice in the written guidelines that comes from a paper on dealing with supervisors who aren't willing to necessarily consider the problems that students might be facing. And this has very advice on how to potentially escalate the situation, and who to speak to. So have a peer mentor group, occupational health services within universities, for example. Another difficult topic that again was another thing mentioned in our workshop, the guidelines, and was that often we have differences in standards of practice between in-country collaborators and our field team that might lead to potential conflicts. So one example that was raised is that in-country collaborators might want to leave paleoseismic trenches open and dump rubbish into them, burn it and save carrying it for the rest of your trip, whilst typically the practice that people in COMET might do is that they might carry the rubbish out with them and dispose of it in a landfill, for example, somewhere else. So hopefully through the code of conduct, you would have accepted that you're committed to reducing environmental impact of your fieldwork. The risk assessment, again, will ask you about what steps have you taken to minimize environmental impacts of your field research. And if you're expecting to be opening a paleoseismic trench, this is one thing that people will have considered. People who have experience working in particular areas have no experiences of rubbish disposal. And then we have a section in the written guidelines again about dealing with standards of practice that may differ between you and in-country collaborators. And this really focuses on trying to get senior members of your field team to liaise with collaborators about what you want to try and do with, in this case, rubbish versus what they might want to do, and to try and come to an agreement and a conclusion. In this case, we were trying to emphasize that we want to respect local culture and customs, as well as trying to adhere to our standards or your standards of practice that you might have. And a final one is that you might have participated in fieldwork and data collection, but you feel that you and your international collaborators have been left out of the development of scientific ideas. So this is one that seemed to come up quite common, be quite common in feedback that we get, which is that people often feel isolated. They feel like they're involved in the kind of grunt work, if you like, of data collection, but they feel isolated from the sort of scientific development of ideas. Again, the code of conduct should emphasize before people travel that you're committed to working as a team and that you've all identified and been agreed to any predefined tasks and roles. The augmented risk assessments got, again, self-reflective questions aimed at trying to get people to recognize how they can get the most out of each team member and what each team member wants to contribute in order to benefit equally from the research. And then finally, in the written guidelines, we've got a whole section that tries to highlight different ways that we can ensure that people can contribute to essentially their maximum capacity whilst on fieldwork. So ensuring that everybody knows the objectives, has the day-to-day plan, has access to all the same information that others might have, be that satellite data or imagery or dating results, for example. A really important one here that kept emerging is choosing common language to use in the field and ensuring that often when we're working with international collaborators, if we're using English, that might be collaborators' second, sometimes third, sometimes fourth language. So we need to ensure that people aren't being left out of the ideas development simply because of the fast pace of the way people speak on fieldwork. And that emerges actually a really critical point that I think can go kind of under considered when we're doing fieldwork. So the written guidelines, again, providing advice on how to proceed with this kind of stuff. So hopefully that's given you a kind of overview of the way that we hope these guidelines and the risk assessment and code of conduct will work. What we want to do is to try and continue to develop what we've got already. So we've got some grant proposals in at the moment to create a video series and explore methods for increasing engagement with the guidelines and getting people to self-reflect on research fieldwork practice. I think in a sense, the kind of people who sign up for a webinar like this are slightly self-selecting. So how do we try to get everybody to engage in these conversations more broadly beyond those people who are just generally interested in making earth sciences a more positive and better workplace for everyone? How do we want to try and create a space, where people can write blogs about how they've changed their research fieldwork practice, so that other people can use that as advice. So we're not necessarily saying that we're going to decide what is best and bad practice, but we want a space where people can have those discussions to try and make it a more important aspect of actually organizing fieldwork. We want to try and collate the examples of really good fieldwork practice in terms of community engagement. There's loads of really interesting and innovative ways that people have created lasting impact in communities from their projects. What we want to try and do is collate those examples. And finally, we want to try and use resources like the things that we might produce there to advocate for changes in funding structure. So, for example, encouraging funding agencies to support low carbon travel, even though it's more expensive, often significantly, supporting costings for collaborators, international collaborators on UK grant applications too, and making it easier to share costings with international collaborators, so that the results of our research can be more equitable from fieldwork research. Okay, so that's kind of all I was going to cover. This should be time for kind of discussion and feedback. I'm interested to hear what people have done through their own institutions, if anybody's got any thoughts on what we're trying to do. And also, just as a note back, anybody who's in COMET or isn't in COMET, we're actually trying to run a small program to highlight COMET scientists' work for International Women and Girls in Science Day, which is coming up in 2 or 3 weeks. So if Chi could post, we've got a little nomination form where you can nominate some great work that any of your colleagues have done over the past few years. That'd be great. Okay.
Thanks, Sam. That was great. Yeah, so as Sam says, please post any questions that you've got in the chat or the Q&A function. If you use the Q&A function, you can also ask them anonymously, I think. So you can post them there. I think we do have one question in the chat at the moment. So,
oh yeah, is there a website where I could find these documents? Yes, so we've got it's currently a kind of Google Doc. We have we will be putting them and making them open access on a website at some point. We're currently between potentially getting some money to typeset them properly and potentially not. So when we find out about that, then we'll make them open access. But obviously we want to try and get have people be able to engage with them and contribute to them, but also not have it open so that anybody can write whatever they want in it, because we know that the internet can be both a constructive place and a not so constructive space sometimes. So we will be making them openly available probably before the summer.
Great, and thanks, Chi, for posting the link. So hopefully you can all see the link in the chat now. So it'd be great if some of you could bookmark that link and maybe take 5-10 minutes to think about someone that you could nominate for this. And the nomination deadline is the 3rd of February. So that's Chi, thank you.
So Nick's put something in the Q&A which says, could we circulate a COMET effort maybe through, everything's moving around, through one of the video training series or a written guideline document that would commit COMET members to critiquing papers that do or don't include descriptions of these field practices during journal peer review? That might be one of the few avenues ECRs have to make PIs listen to these guidelines. Yeah, I mean, so there's I know in other fields there's kind of provenance type things that people have to fill out for where their samples come from, for example, which means that people are, I think it's kind of common in paleontology now, because that had a bit of a reckoning with where a lot of the samples come from. So yeah, having something where emphasizing fieldwork practice and making it clear that this is kind of part of being a scientist is trying to make the academy better for everyone, I think is a really important way to get people to engage with it. But also you would hope people would also just engage with it on a kind of moral level of making working practice better for colleagues as well. Yeah, I think that's one interesting way of trying to do it too, is coming at it from multiple directions, both trying to drive it from a grassroots level, from scientists for scientists, but also trying to drive it from I guess that's a bit more of a top-down level, getting journals and whatnot to ask about fieldwork practice. Jess asked, should in-country collaborators sign the code of conduct? Yeah, that's a good point. That's something we discussed quite a bit, I think, when we were in some of our kind of fortnightly meetings, is, you know, who actually signs on to this? Do in-country collaborators do it as well? I think my feeling on this was that I would say that this is what we're signing up to, and explain the purpose of it to my collaborators, and give them the option to sign up to it too. That would be the way that I would use these guidelines. I haven't actually been on Fieldwork since we've rewritten them because of COVID, so but I guess that's personal preference. I mean, we currently have, you know, there's no requirement for anybody to use any of these documents at all, so it's all our choice. But I think it's something to reflect on. Elizabeth asks, what happens when a higher up team member does not follow the guidelines? Is there a post-field discussion? Is there someone to intervene remotely and have a discussion with the gatekeeper? Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think that's something that we've in the guidelines, the way that we have them written is that we try to have an ally for every field member who is not in the field. So somebody who could be in the field with you, but also someone who's a kind of informed member who's accessible and contactable, who's not in the field with you, who might be a senior academic as well. So they would be someone who hopefully you could use to try and get a bit more accountability for people who break the fieldwork practice. One thing we also, and has been raised in some of the things that people have said in our guidelines, is that if you have the code of conduct, it gives you a point of reference to raise an issue. If you, a lot of the time people are gaslighted for, you know, you say, oh, I'm not so sure this is what we should be doing, and then someone will say, oh, we've always done it like this. But then the code of conduct and the risk assessment gives you a point of reference to say, you know, we're explicitly breaking this commitment that we made. So hopefully that is also another way that we can that the guidelines can address an issue like that. There's a question here. I'm curious to know if anyone can offer a best practice approach to removing someone whose behavior has become so destructive and toxic that the team members feel unsafe. Yeah, that's something that I'm not 100% sure about. How do you actually remove an individual if you're in the field with them, or how do you generally the way that we focus the guidelines or the guidance in the guidelines that we have is that that person who's, if you're in a very, very small team, so if there's two of you, for example, there should, the focus immediately should be on trying to protect the individual who feels that they're unsafe. So having a strategy and having somebody who's not in the field with you, but is a contactable and informed ally at your institution who can help you arrange to get a flight home, for example, or to help you get in touch with colleagues who are in the country that you're at. But that's a really difficult question. But we've focused instead of removing the person who's who might be contributing to a toxic research culture, we'd focus on trying to protect the individuals or protect the people who feel that they're being harassed or whatever the issue is. I think, yeah, the accountability question is one that's really, really difficult to address. So that's why we want to try and do as much as we can beforehand by having things like the code of conduct, by having things like the risk assessment, and really focusing on laying out the ground rules to try and mitigate those kinds of problems before they arise. And then another question, are funding agencies in the UK supporting these community efforts by making it a requirement to have safe field activities? Not that I know of, and it varies from institution to institution about what kind of risk assessment you fill in. I know some universities have a lot of these types of questions that we have on our risk assessment in their standard risk assessments anyway. and some others don't. So what we're trying to do here is firstly just level the playing field. And then somebody asks, what about projects funded by NERC? That's above my pay grade because I've never actually applied for a big project funded by NERC. So there'll be other people who probably know better than me, probably people who are on this webinar, whether they have. I mean, I presume this you've got to fill out some kind of risk assessment that says how you're gonna address potential issues related to the impact of fieldwork, but you've got to try and account for it. But I think it's, yeah, that's something for someone who, other people who actually applied to NERC projects know a lot more about that than I do. Okay.
I had a quick follow on from Nicholas's question. So
Yep.
Obviously it's not always practical to include complete descriptions of all the field activities in all your publications.
Yeah,
could be something that you fit in the acknowledgements or in one of the appendices sections. So could we have some specific text or example text that you would put in a publication to say that you followed different aspects of the guidelines, and that could provide a way sort of collating all that information and finding the papers that have actually used these guidelines.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good point. We could definitely do that. So that's something we could try and put together a piece of text that people include, and that would be good. Once we've got them kind of open access and everyone can get at them, that would be a good way to widen participation and get more people involved in using them and contributing to them too. So yeah, that sounds good.
Great.
Good idea, Scott.
Thanks. Okay, I can't see any of the questions at the moment. Any more questions over in Leeds, Chief?